At a farmhouse in Massachusetts, an old man opened his eyes for the last time and said 4 words. Thomas Jefferson still lives. He was wrong. He did not know he was wrong. 500 miles south, in a small upstairs bedroom in Virginia, the man he was speaking of had died several hours earlier that same morning. There was no way for John Adams to have known this. No telegraph existed. No telephone. The news of a death in Virginia would take days to reach Massachusetts by horse and ship, the way all news traveled in 1826. Adams spoke those words into a room of family members who did not correct him, because they did not know either, and because there are some things you do not interrupt a dying man to argue about. He was 90 years old. It was the 4th of July. It was not simply the 4th of July. It was the 4th of July, 1826, 50 years to the day since the Continental Congress had approved the document that both of these men, more than any other 2 people in the room where it happened, had shaped into existence. 50 years since the United States of America had announced on paper that it existed. And on the 50th anniversary of that announcement, within hours of each other, the 2 men most responsible for writing it were both dead. This is not a metaphor historians invented later to make the story tidier. This actually happened, on this exact date, to these 2 specific men. And by the time the country understood what had occurred, it would search for an explanation that made philosophical and even religious sense, because the coincidence was, by any reasonable measure, almost impossible to accept as simply chance. To understand why this mattered so much, why an entire nation reacted to 2 old men dying as though it had witnessed a sign from heaven, you have to go back 50 years to 2 very different men in a hot room in Philadelphia who did not particularly like each other and who needed each other anyway. In June of 1776, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia to declare formal independence from the crown that governed them. A committee of 5 was assigned to draft the formal declaration. John Adams of Massachusetts was on it. 40 years old, a lawyer, blunt, vain in a way he was honest enough to admit to in his own letters, and one of the most forceful advocates for independence in the entire Congress. Thomas Jefferson of Virginia was also on it. 33 years old, quieter than Adams, more reserved in public debate, but possessed of a gift for written language that Adams himself recognized and respected enough to insist that Jefferson, not Adams, should be the one to write the actual draft. Adams made this decision deliberately. He later explained his reasoning in a letter. Jefferson had a happier talent for composition. Adams was obnoxious and disliked, by his own description of himself, and Virginia needed to be seen leading the effort if the Southern colonies were going to commit fully to the cause. Jefferson protested that Adams should write it. Adams insisted. Jefferson wrote it. What Jefferson produced in roughly 17 days, in a rented room above a Philadelphia bricklayer's shop, became one of the most consequential documents in political history. The Congress edited it heavily, cut roughly a quarter of the text, and on July 4, 1776, approved the final version. Adams and Jefferson had become, through this collaboration, genuine friends, not merely political allies. Adams's wife Abigail corresponded with Jefferson with real warmth. The 2 men respected each other's intellect in a way that crossed the considerable differences in their temperaments. Adams excitable and combative, Jefferson cool and indirect, the kind of personality difference that produces either deep partnership or deep resentment depending on what happens next. What happened next was the presidency, and it produced both. By the 1790s, the unified front of the Revolution had splintered into the first organized political parties in American history. Adams aligned with the Federalists, who favored a stronger central government and closer ties with Britain. Jefferson became the leader of the Democratic Republicans, who favored states' rights and sympathized more with revolutionary France. The friendship that had survived the writing of the Declaration did not survive the formation of American political parties. In the election of 1796, Adams won the presidency and Jefferson, under the electoral rules of the time, became his vice president, 2 men who were now political rivals serving in the executive branch together, an arrangement the framers had not fully anticipated would produce as much dysfunction as it did. The election of 1800 was worse. It was one of the ugliest presidential campaigns in early American history, conducted through newspapers that operated less like journalism and more like coordinated character assassination. Jefferson's supporters accused Adams of being a monarchist who wanted to restore something close to British rule. Adams's supporters accused Jefferson of being a godless radical who would import the guillotine politics of the French Revolution. Some of this was exaggeration. Some of it reflected genuine and serious disagreement about what kind of country America was supposed to become. Jefferson won. Adams, in a decision that would later be remembered as a quiet but significant act of democratic norm-setting, accepted the loss and left office peacefully, one of the first times in modern history that a head of state had voluntarily transferred power to a political opponent after losing an election. But the personal cost was real. Adams left Washington before Jefferson's inauguration. He did not attend the ceremony. The two men, who had once written to each other with the warmth of true intellectual companions, did not speak for more than a decade. The break was not theatrical. It was worse than theatrical, it was simply absence. No letters. No correspondence. Two men who had changed the world together, sitting in their respective homes in Massachusetts and Virginia, deliberately not writing to one another for 12 years. It was a mutual friend who finally intervened. Dr. Benjamin Rush, a physician and fellow signer of the Declaration who had remained close to both men, had been urging reconciliation for years. He wrote to Adams. He wrote to Jefferson. He had, by his own account, dreamed about the two of them reconciling, and he used that dream, perhaps strategically, perhaps sincerely, as part of his appeal to each of them. In January of 1812, John Adams wrote a short letter to Thomas Jefferson. The opening was almost deliberately understated, the kind of casual reopening that lets both parties save face. He mentioned sending Jefferson some homespun cloth produced in Massachusetts, a minor domestic detail, nothing political, nothing that demanded a response weighted with history. Jefferson wrote back. What followed over the next 14 years was one of the most remarkable correspondences in American history. 158 letters exchanged between two former presidents, two men in their 70s and 80s, writing across the distance between Massachusetts and Virginia about philosophy, religion, history, aging, death, and the meaning of the revolution they had both helped to start. They argued. They agreed. They reminisced. Adams, characteristically blunt, complained about his declining health and his fading memory with a candor that Jefferson, more reserved by temperament, rarely matched but clearly enjoyed reading. Jefferson wrote with the careful, somewhat formal elegance that had always characterized his prose, even when the subject was as intimate as his own mortality. These were two men who understood, with increasing clarity as the years passed, that they were among the last living architects of the American founding. George Washington was long dead. Benjamin Franklin was long dead. The men who remained from that original generation were dwindling, and Adams and Jefferson, separated by hundreds of miles and the political wounds of decades earlier, had found their way back to each other in time to spend their final years as something close to what they had once been. By 1826, both men were in failing health. Jefferson, at Monticello, was 83 years old, suffering from chronic illness and deeply in debt, a financial collapse that would eventually force the sale of his estate and his enormous personal library after his death. Adams, at his farm in Quincy, Massachusetts, was 90 years old, nearly blind, his hands too unsteady to write his own letters in his final years, dictating to family members instead. Both men knew the 50th anniversary of the Declaration was approaching. Both had been invited to attend celebrations. Both were too ill to travel. Jefferson, in one of the final letters of his life, was asked to write something for the Washington, D.C. celebration of the anniversary, since he could not attend in person. He composed a short statement, his last formal public writing, in which he expressed hope that the principles of the Declaration would continue to spread, that the day would come when the mass of mankind had not been born, as he put it, with saddles on their backs for a privileged few to ride. It was Jefferson's final word to the country he had helped found, written from his sickbed, sent ahead because he understood he would not live to deliver it himself. He was right about that, though he likely did not know how precisely right he would prove to be. On the morning of July 4, 1826, Thomas Jefferson was dying. He had been fading for days, drifting in and out of consciousness, attended by his family and his physician at Monticello. Accounts from those present describe him waking periodically and asking what day it was, a specific and pointed question from a man who, his family later believed, was holding on with whatever will remain to him specifically to see the anniversary date arrive. When told it was not yet the 4th, he settled back. This happened more than once in his final days. He died at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon on July 4, 1826. 500 miles north, John Adams was also dying, also surrounded by family, also fading through the same July heat. He had been declining for weeks. On the morning of the 4th, he was asked if he knew what day it was. He reportedly answered that it was a great day, a good day. Sometime later that afternoon, as his strength continued to fail, he spoke his final words. Thomas Jefferson still lives. He died a few hours later, in the early evening of July 4, 1826. Neither man knew about the other. There was no way they could have. The distance between Quincy and Monticello, by the fastest transportation available in 1826, would have taken the newsdays to cross even if anyone had been positioned to send it the moment it happened. Adams died believing, with his final breath, that his old friend and rival was still alive somewhere in Virginia, still present in the world, still carrying forward whatever remained of the revolution they had built together. He was wrong by a matter of hours. He could not have known it. When the news reached the rest of the country over the following days and weeks, the reaction was something close to disbelief, and then, for many Americans of that era, something close to religious awe. The newspapers of 1826 did not have the vocabulary of statistical probability that a modern audience might reach for to process a coincidence like this. What they had instead was the vocabulary of providence, the deeply held belief, widely shared across early 19th century American Christianity, that significant events did not simply happen by accident, that a meaningful pattern in the world was evidence of divine intention. Two of the last surviving authors of American independence, dying on the 50th anniversary of the document they had written together, within hours of each other, after 14 years of restored friendship conducted entirely through letters because they were too frail and too far apart to ever meet in person again. To the Americans of 1826, this did not read as coincidence. It read as confirmation that the revolution itself had been sanctioned by something larger than the men who carried it out, and that those men had been permitted to see the fullness of what they built before being released from the task of witnessing it. Daniel Webster delivered a eulogy in Boston that would become one of the most famous pieces of American oratory of the era, framing the dual deaths explicitly as evidence that Providence had been watching over the nation since its founding. Newspapers across the country ran the story with the same framing. The coincidence became, almost immediately, part of the American mythology of its own founding, proof, to a young nation still working out what it believed about itself, that something larger than ordinary history had attended its birth. A third founder had died on the same date 5 years earlier. James Monroe, the fifth president, also died on July 4th in 1831, 5 years after Adams and Jefferson. 3 of the first 5 American presidents, dying on the exact anniversary of the nation's independence, within the span of a single decade. Historians have spent 2 centuries debating whether there is any explanation beyond coincidence, and the honest answer is that there almost certainly is not, except for the specific psychological phenomenon, documented in modern medicine, in which dying patients sometimes appear to hold on for a meaningful date before letting go. Whether that phenomenon, sometimes called the death delay effect, has any real physiological basis or is simply a pattern people notice in hindsight remains genuinely disputed among researchers. What is not disputed is that it happened to Adams and Jefferson, on the day it mattered most, in front of a nation that needed, in 1826, exactly this kind of story to tell about itself. The friendship that produced the letters, the 158 letters written across 14 years of reconciliation, survives in full, preserved in archives, studied by historians as one of the richest records of 2 founders' private thinking in their final years. In those letters, Adams and Jefferson argued about aristocracy and natural rights, about religion and the existence of God, about which of them had contributed more to the cause they had both served. They forgave each other in the slow and undramatic way that real forgiveness usually happens. Not in a single gesture, but across years of small honest sentences, sent back and forth, each one slightly closer than the last. In one of his letters, Adams wrote to Jefferson that he did not believe either of them feared death, because they had both lived long enough and done enough to be at peace with what was coming. He was writing by that point as a man genuinely preparing for the end, and so, in his own way, was Jefferson. What they could not have known, writing those letters in their 70s and 80s, was the specific date on which their preparation would be tested. Neither man chose July 4th, 1826. No one chooses the day of their death with that kind of precision, Not really, not in any way medicine or science can verify. But something in two very old, very different men, who had once changed the world together and then spent 12 years apart and then found their way back to each other through cloth and letters in old age, arranged itself so that the date carried meaning neither of them could have engineered. Quincy, Massachusetts, and Monticello, Virginia, are both museums now. Adams's home, Peacefield, sits in what is today a quiet historical district, preserved largely as it was. Monticello, Jefferson's mountaintop estate, draws hundreds of thousands of visitors a year, its dome and columns instantly recognizable from the back of the American nickel, its grounds still tended in the patterns Jefferson laid out himself, including the gardens where he experimented obsessively with plant species for most of his adult life. In both places, July 4th is still marked. Visitors come specifically for the anniversary, walk the same rooms, stand in the same gardens, and are told, by docents who have told the story thousands of times, about the coincidence that made this particular date matter twice over for these two particular houses. Let the evening settle around you tonight. Somewhere in Virginia, at a house on a mountain that Jefferson designed himself down to the smallest architectural detail, the light moves across the lawn in late afternoon the same way it moved on the day he died. Somewhere in Massachusetts, in a farmhouse that has stood for more than 2 centuries, the same July heat that filled the room when Adams spoke his final words still arrives every summer, on schedule, indifferent to what it once witnessed. Two old men, who disagreed about almost everything except the one thing that mattered most, found their way back to friendship through 14 years of careful letters, and then left the world within hours of each other, on the one day in the calendar that could not have been more precisely chosen if either of them had tried. Thomas Jefferson still lives, Adams said, and did not know he was wrong. In a way that has nothing to do with biology, he might not have been. Let that thought rest with you tonight, in the particular quiet of an old American summer evening, the kind both of those men would have recognized.